A fat 16-year-old paid $1 for the most feared mountain man, but he had shocking plans. Dust rises in a Colorado town square. The sheriff's hammer falls, and chains rattle as the most feared mountain man steps onto the auction block. The crowd jeers, until a fat 16-year-old girl raises a single silver dollar. Gasps, laughter, hatred. She's mocked by her own kin. But the gavel strikes, and the town watches in silence as the wildest man of the Rockies is handed to the girl no one respects. Everyone expects blood, escape, murder in the night. But instead, the mountain man bows his head and whispers that he belongs to her now. Why would a man feared by lawmen, killers, and the wilderness itself surrender to a girl the world calls worthless? And when he reveals his secret plan, one that could shake the railroad, the sheriff, and the whole valley, will her single dollar buy only shame, or the courage to change everything? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The hot summer sun beat down mercilessly on the Colorado mining town square, baking the wooden planks of the auction block until they released waves of shimmer into the dusty air. Sheriff Amos Dunn stood with his hands hooked in his gun belt, squinting against the glare as townsfolk gathered around the weathered platform. The creak of the rickety steps echoed across the square as prisoners were marched forward, their chains rattling with each heavy step. "Another fine batch for the mines," a man in the crowd called out, drawing scattered laughter. The prisoners shuffled forward, heads bowed, their spirits as worn as their tattered clothes. At the edge of the crowd, 16-year-old Hattie Mae Carter pressed her silver dollar so tightly into her palm that its edges left marks in her damp skin. She tried to make herself smaller, which wasn't easy given her size, as people pressed in around her. The weight of stares and whispers followed her everywhere in town. But today she forced herself to stay, even as her stepmother's sharp voice cut through the crowd behind her. "Look at her," her stepmother hissed to Hattie's stepbrothers. "Standing there like she belongs. She'll just embarrass us again." Hattie's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the auction block. The sheriff's voice rang out, announcing prices as men were sold off to the mines one by one. Each slam of his gavel made her jump. Then a hush fell over the crowd. The last prisoner emerged from the jailhouse, and even the wind seemed to still. Bear. McCallum stood head and shoulders above the guards who flanked him, his massive frame making their rifles look like toys. Tangled dark hair and an unkempt beard couldn't hide the mass of scars that marked his face. His wrists and ankles were bound with double chains, the links thick as a man's thumb. "Well, if it ain't the mountain devil himself," someone whispered loudly enough for all to hear. "Heard he killed 3 lawmen up in Montana territory." "5, another voice corrected, "and that ain't counting the settlers." Hattie watched as Bear was led to the center of the platform. He moved like a caged grizzly, each step measured and powerful despite his chains. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, swept across the crowd without expression. When his gaze passed over Hattie, she felt a shiver despite the heat. Sheriff Dunn cleared his throat there. Next up, the prisoner, known as Bear McCallum, charged with resisting arrest and assault on a peace officer. He paused, letting the charges hang in the air. "Bidding starts at $1. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew what happened to violent men sold to the mines. Few survived their first year. "Ain't worth a penny," a miner shouted. "Let him rot." 50 cents, another called mockingly. "To watch him break." Hattie's heart hammered against her ribs. The silver dollar felt like it was burning in her hand now. Before she could think better of it, she raised her arm. $1. Her voice came out higher and shakier than she'd intended, but clear enough to carry. The square went silent. Then, as people realized who had spoken, the laughter started. Harsh, mocking laughter that Hattie knew all too well. "Well, if it ain't the fat Carter girl, what you gonna do with a killer girl? Put him to work in your mama's kitchen?" Her stepmother's voice cut through the jeers. "Hattie Mae Carter, you stop this foolishness right now. Haven't you brought enough shame to this family?" Hattie's legs trembled, but she kept her arm raised, clutching her silver dollar like a shield. She forced herself to look up at the auction block, where Bear McCallum stood watching her. His expression hadn't changed, but something shifted in those dark eyes. A flicker of curiosity? Recognition? Sheriff Dunn looked uncomfortable, his gavel hovering uncertainly. "Now see here, girl. The bid is legal," someone in the crowd called out. "Rules is rules, Sheriff." More laughter followed, but there was an edge to it now. No one else was bidding. They were all too eager to watch what would happen when the fat girl who couldn't do anything right tried to control a notorious mountain man. The sheriff's jaw worked as he looked between Hattie and Bear. $1 bid, he announced finally, his voice strained. Going once. Hattie's stepmother pushed through the crowd. "Hattie, may I forbid?" Going twice. The silver dollar was slick with sweat in Hattie's palm. Bear's eyes hadn't left her face. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Sold. To Miss Carter for $1. The crowd erupted in a mix of laughter and muttering. Hattie forced her feet to move, climbing the steps to the auction block. Each board seemed to groan under her weight, adding to her humiliation. She held out her silver dollar to the sheriff with a trembling hand. Sheriff Dunn snatched it away like it might bite him. "Girl, you've bought yourself more trouble than you know." He gestured to his deputies. "Get him down from there. Make sure those chains are secure." As the guards led Bear down the steps, Hattie couldn't help but notice how he moved. Not with the swagger of a killer, but with the careful precision of someone used to being watched. Up close, she could see that some of his scars were from bullets, others from what looked like claws. His clothes, though ragged, showed signs of careful mending. The crowd parted as Bear was brought to stand before her, the chains between his ankles clinking against the packed dirt. Now that she was close enough to smell the prison soap on him, Hattie's moment of courage began to falter. What had she done? What was she supposed to do with him? "He's your responsibility now," Sheriff Dunn announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Any trouble he causes, any damage he does, it's all on your head, girl. And if he runs..." The sheriff let the threat hang unfinished. Hattie squared her shoulders, trying to stand as tall as her frame would allow. She might be the girl everyone mocked, the one no one believed in, but she had done this. She had made this choice. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadier now. "I understand." Her stepmother had pushed forward again, face red with fury. "You'll understand when your father hears about this. Buying a criminal like some stray dog? Have you lost what little sense you had?" But Hattie kept her eyes on Bear. This close, she could see that his eyes weren't just dark. They held flecks of amber, like sunlight through storm clouds. He studied her with the same careful attention she gave him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse. "Much obliged, miss," he said simply. The words were so unexpected, so at odds with his fearsome reputation, that another hush fell over the crowd. Hattie felt warmth bloom in her chest. Not embarrassment this time, but something else. Something that felt almost like hope. The sheriff signaled to his deputies, "Get that contract written up. Miss Carter, you'll need to sign for him." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Last chance to back out of this foolishness, girl. Man like that'll snap your neck soon as look at you." But Hattie remembered the careful mending on Bear's clothes, the way he moved to avoid drawing attention, the simple courtesy in his words. She thought of all the stories about him, all the fearsome tales, and wondered for the first time how many of them were true. "I'll sign," she said. As she followed the sheriff toward his office, she was aware of Bear being led behind her, his chains marking each step. The crowd lingered, whispering and pointing. Her stepmother's angry voice rose above the murmurs, promising consequences. But Hattie kept walking, her empty palm still tingling where the silver dollar had been. She had spent her last coin, defied her family, and tied her fate to a man everyone feared. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in her life, she had made a choice that was completely her own. Evening shadows crept across the town square as the last prisoners were led away. The crowd had thinned, but curious onlookers still lingered, watching the strange pair by the auction block, the massive mountain man in chains and the overweight girl who had bought him for $1. Hattie Mae shifted from foot to foot, painfully aware of every eye upon them. Bear McCallum stood beside her like a statue, his presence as solid and immovable as the mountains themselves. She barely came up to his chest, and his shadow fell across her like a blanket. Her stepmother, Martha Carter, stormed over with Hattie's 2 stepbrothers in tow. "Well, You've made your bed, girl. Now you can lie in it. She straightened her shawl with sharp, angry movements. If you think we're helping you march this killer back to the homestead, you're even more addled than I thought. Tom, the older stepbrother, spat in the dust near Bear's feet. Reckon he'll snap her neck before they reach Miller's Creek. Reckon you're right, Luke, the younger one, agreed with a mean laugh. Serve her right, too. Hattie's face burned, but she forced herself to stand straight. I signed the papers. He's my responsibility. Then get him home yourself, Martha snapped. She turned on her heel, gesturing for Tom and Luke to follow. Don't expect supper held for you, assuming you make it back at all. They strode away, leaving Hattie alone with her towering charge. The deputy had handed her the key to Bear's chains, along with a stern warning about the consequences if she released him before reaching home. Now that key felt like it weighed 100 pounds in her pocket. This way, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She started down the dusty road that led east out of town, trying not to flinch at the sound of chains behind her. The remaining townsfolk followed at a distance like crows trailing a wounded animal. Their whispers carried on the evening air. He'll kill her for sure, fool girl. Always was simple in the head. Ain't natural, a thing like her thinking she can control a man like that. Hattie's eyes stung, but she blinked hard, refusing to cry. The road stretched before them, rutted from wagon wheels and grown over with weeds at the edges. It was nearly 2 miles to the homestead, and the sun was already touching the western peaks. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when Bear's deep voice rumbled behind her. So unexpected, she nearly stumbled. What's your name, girl? Hattie glanced back, startled. His face was half in shadow, but his eyes caught the fading sunlight. There was no menace in his expression, only a quiet curiosity. Hattie May, she stammered, then felt foolish for stuttering. Hattie May Carter. Bear nodded slowly as if considering this. Hattie May, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her name sound different. Not like something to mock, but like something worthy of respect. A good name. The watching townsfolk must have decided they weren't going to see any immediate violence, because their numbers began to dwindle. Soon only a few boys on horseback remained, trailing far behind and whooping occasionally to startle Hattie. The sun had nearly set by the time they reached the Carter homestead. It wasn't much. A 2-room cabin with a lean-to kitchen added on, a small barn, and a chicken coop that listed to one side. But it was home, or the closest thing Hattie had to one since her father died 3 years ago. Martha was waiting on the porch, arms crossed. Well, you actually made it, though what you expect us to do with him now is beyond me. She jerked her head toward the kitchen. Get in here and help with supper. You can chain your pet killer to the post out back. He's coming inside, Hattie said, surprising herself with her own firmness. He needs to eat too. The girl's right, Bear spoke up, his voice level. Can't work proper without food. But I'll take my meal wherever you say, ma'am. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, but something in Bear's calm deference seemed to deflate her anger slightly. Fine. Kitchen table. But those chains stay on. The kitchen was cramped with all of them crowded around the rough-hewn table. Tom and Luke had to squeeze past Bear to reach their seats, and they made a show of keeping their distance. Martha banged pots and bowls around more than necessary as she served up beans and cornbread. Bear's chains clinked softly as he ate, taking small, careful bites despite what must have been fierce hunger. When Martha grudgingly offered him seconds, he shook his head. Much obliged, ma'am, but water will do fine. Tom, emboldened by Bear's quiet manner, decided to test him. Bet prison food was worse than Ma's beans. They feed you raw rats up there? Tom, Hattie protested, but Bear held up one massive hand. No, miss. Let him speak his piece. Those dark eyes fixed on Tom with the same steady attention Bear might give to a snake in his path. You want to know what prison was like, boy? It was a place where men forgot they were men, where they did things that haunt them in the night. His voice dropped lower. But I ain't in prison now. Know why? Tom swallowed hard. Why? Because this girl here, Bear nodded toward Hattie, showed mercy when she didn't have to. And I mean to honor that mercy. I serve her now, by my choice, not just by law. He leaned forward slightly, chains whispering. so you might want to think careful about how you treat her in my presence." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of Martha's clock and the far-off cry of a coyote. Tom suddenly found his plate fascinating, while Luke couldn't seem to stop staring at Bear with a mixture of fear and awe. Martha cleared her throat. "Well, he can sleep in the barn. I won't have him in the house." "Yes, ma'am," Bear agreed easily. "Barn suits me fine." Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house had grown quiet, Hattie crept out to check on him. The barn door was open to catch the breeze, and lamplight spilled out into the yard. She meant to just peek in, make sure he was settled, but something made her pause in the shadows. Bear knelt in the straw, chains pooled around him. His hands were clasped, head bowed, and his voice carried softly on the night air. "Lord, you know I've wasted years running, fighting when I should have yielded, letting anger eat at my soul until I nearly forgot who I was." He drew a deep breath. "But today you sent me mercy in a strange form. A girl with courage enough to see past what others say. Help me be worthy of that mercy. Help me serve her true, and maybe find my way back to the man you meant me to be. Amen." Hattie backed away silently, her heart pounding. The stories had painted Bear McCallum as a monster, a killer without conscience. But monsters didn't prey in the dark. Monsters didn't speak of mercy with such raw gratitude. She looked up at the stars, thinking of how he had said her name, Hattie May, like it was something precious. Like she was something precious. For the first time since the auction block, she felt certain she had made the right choice. A warm breeze stirred the aspens, carrying the sweet scent of late summer. In the barn, the lamp flickered, and Bear's chains clinked softly as he made his bed in the straw. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this moment, Hattie Mae Carter felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. She walked back to the house, her steps lighter despite the weight of responsibility she carried. Whatever the town thought, whatever her family believed, she knew now that Bear McCallum was not what everyone assumed. He was something else entirely. A man seeking redemption who had recognized in her small act of mercy a chance to reclaim his soul. And somehow, without quite understanding how, Hattie knew that her life would never be the same. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold. Hattie Mae blinked awake to the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood. The sound was steady, purposeful, nothing like her brother's erratic chopping when they could be bothered to do the chore at all. She pulled aside the faded curtain and peered out her small window. There in the yard stood Bear McCallum, his chains removed but still wearing yesterday's prison clothes. His powerful shoulders rose and fell with each swing, the axe blade flashing in the early light. Already a neat stack of split wood rose beside him, each piece perfectly sized for the kitchen stove. As she watched, he paused, setting the axe carefully aside. Without breaking stride, he moved to the sagging fence line that marked the edge of their property. His big hands ran along the weathered rails, testing their strength. Finding a loose post, he braced himself and pushed it straight, tamping the soil firm around its base. The squeak of saddle leather made Hattie Mae turn. 3 of the neighbor women were riding past, their heads bent together in conversation. They made no effort to lower their voices. "Would you look at that? The Carter girl's pet convict playing at being civilized? Mark my words, he'll murder them all in their beds before the week's out. Shame about the girl. Always was simple, but this takes the cake." Heat rose in Hattie's cheeks. She let the curtain fall and dressed quickly, pulling on her sturdiest work dress. The kitchen already smelled of coffee when she came downstairs. Martha stood at the stove, her back rigid with disapproval. "Your creature's been up since before first light," she said without turning. "Making himself useful, I'll grant you that much. But don't think that means he's staying." "He has nowhere else to go," Hattie said quietly. "That's not our problem. I won't have a killer under my roof." "He sleeps in the barn," Hattie pointed out, "and don't sass me, girl." Martha slapped bowls of porridge onto the table as Tom and Luke clattered down the stairs. "He goes, and that's final." The screen door creaked and Bear ducked his head to enter. Despite hours of labor, his breathing was even, his movements controlled. He filled the kitchen doorway like a shadow made solid. "Morning, ma'am," he said politely. "Miss Hattie Mae." Martha's lips pinched tight. "Might as well eat while you can, but after breakfast you'll need to move on. We can't keep you here." Bear settled onto the bench, which groaned under his weight. He picked up his spoon with deliberate care. "With respect, ma'am, I aim to stay." "You what?" Martha's voice rose sharply. "The girl bought my contract fair and legal. That means 1 year of honest work." His dark eyes met Martha's. "I mean to honor that contract. And if I refuse to have you here, then you'll need to take it up with the sheriff." Bear's voice remained steady. "Law says the contract holder decides where I serve my time. That's Miss Hattie Mae." Tom snickered. "Since when does an outlaw care about the law?" "Since somebody showed me mercy," Bear replied simply. He turned to Hattie Mae. "If you're willing, miss, I'd like to show you how to mend that fence proper. Needs doing before winter comes." Hattie Mae nodded, grateful for the chance to escape the kitchen's tension. She hurried through her breakfast while Martha fumed silently, and her brothers traded uncertain glances. The morning air was crisp, hinting at autumn's approach. Bear led her to the fence line, explaining as they walked. "Post needs to go deep," he said, demonstrating the proper depth with his hands. "At least 2 feet, or the frost heaves will push it up come spring. Then you brace it true and square before you set your rails." He showed her how to test the post's stability, how to angle the rails so water would run off instead of pooling and rotting the wood. His huge hands were surprisingly gentle as he guided her through each step. "There now," he said as she lifted a rail into place. "You've got the strength for it, sure enough. Good strong back and solid legs. That's what you need for ranch work." Hattie Mae froze, waiting for the joke about her size, the cruel laughter she'd grown to expect. But Bear just nodded approvingly and handed her the next rail. "Most folks don't appreciate the value of being stout-built," he continued matter-of-factly. "But I've seen too many willowy types break under the strain of frontier life. You've got the kind of strength that lasts." Warmth bloomed in her chest, different from the familiar heat of shame. This was pride, she realized. Pride in her body's capability. In work, well done. She found herself standing straighter as they moved down the fence line together. The sun climbed higher and more neighbors rode past. Some called out mocking greetings, while others just stared. Bear paid them no mind, focused entirely on teaching Hattie Mae the proper way to repair the fence. By afternoon, her arms ached pleasantly, and a long stretch of fence stood solid and true. As the day cooled toward evening, Bear built a small fire near the barn for cooking. He showed her how to make coffee in a tin pot, the way he'd learned in the mountains. They sat together on upturned buckets, watching the flames dance while crickets began their evening song. "Reckon you're wondering about my past," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "About why I was in that prison." Hattie Mae nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Spent 15 years in the high country, living wild. Wasn't always alone. Had a partner for a while, man named Jameson. Good man, or so I thought." Bear sipped his coffee. "One day we came across a stagecoach robbery. 3 men dead, including the driver. Jameson. He wanted to take the strong box and run. I said no. Said we had to report it. Try to catch who did it." He stared into the flames. "We fought." He pulled his gun. I was faster. A long pause. "When the law came, they found me with 3 dead men, a dead partner, and a strong box full of gold. Didn't matter what I said about trying to do right. Already had a reputation as a mountain wild man, you see. Jury took one look at me and decided I was guilty." Hattie Mae's heart ached for the pain in his voice. "And how long were you in prison?" 2 years, would have been longer, but some witnesses finally came forward. Admitted they'd seen the real robbers fleeing the scene. His mouth twisted. By then, though, most folks had made up their minds about me. Easier to believe I was a killer than admit they'd been wrong. He turned to look at her directly. "That dollar you spent yesterday? It bought more than my contract, Miss Hattie Mae. It bought me a chance to prove I'm not what they say. That's a debt I can't repay with just labor." Hattie Mae stared down at her rough hands calloused from farm work. "I know what it's like," she said softly. "Having people decide what you are without really seeing you. Everyone thinks I'm just the fat girl, the stupid girl, the one who'll never amount to anything. Those people are blind," Bear said firmly. "I've known warriors and hunters, traders and chiefs. I've seen every kind of courage there is. But yesterday, watching a young girl stand up to that whole town to show kindness to a stranger, that was pure grit." He smiled slightly. "You've got more steel in your spine than anyone else in this valley, Miss Hattie May." She blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the simple dignity in his words. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she was someone worth respecting, someone with value beyond her size or her looks. The fire crackled softly as darkness settled over the land. In the house, she could see Martha's lamp moving from window to window, checking on them. But for the first time in years, Hattie May didn't feel the weight of her stepmother's disapproval. She sat up straighter on her bucket, feeling the good ache of honest work in her muscles and the warm glow of earned pride in her heart. Bear added another stick to the fire, his movements precise and careful despite his size. In the flickering light, she could see the scars on his hands, marks of survival, of a life lived wild and free in the mountains. Yet those same hands had shown her nothing but gentleness today, guiding her through tasks no one had ever bothered to teach her before. She thought about his words, about grit and steel and courage, about seeing people for who they truly were, not who others claimed them to be. Perhaps that was why God had brought them together. Two souls who understood what it meant to be judged and found wanting, yet refused to let those judgments define them. The evening star appeared above the mountains, bright and steady in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers from the neighbors, new battles with her family. But sitting here in the peaceful dusk, Hattie May felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father died. The quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, becoming exactly who she was meant to be. A week passed like water flowing in a mountain stream. The late summer sun beat down on the homestead as Bear and Hattie May loaded the wagon for their supply run into town. The wooden wheels creaked under sacks of grain, meant for trading, while the horses stamped impatiently in their traces. "Mind those reins now," Bear instructed, his deep voice gentle as always when teaching. "Keep 'em firm but not tight. Horses know their business if you let them." Hattie May nodded, adjusting her grip. The past week had brought changes she'd never expected. Her arms were stronger from fence mending, her back straighter from Bear's quiet encouragement. Even her stepmother's sharp tongue seemed to sting less these days. The town road stretched before them, dusty and rutted. Hattie May felt the familiar knot of anxiety as buildings came into view. Town meant stares and whispers, meant dealing with folks who'd never seen her as anything but a burden. "Head high," Bear reminded her, as if reading her thoughts. "You've got as much right to be here as anyone." The general store's bell jingled as they entered. Mr. Peterson, the owner, watched them warily from behind his counter. Bear moved with deliberate care, keeping his movements slow and steady as they gathered their supplies. Hattie May noticed how he positioned himself to shield her from the worst of the stares. "Flour's gone up again," she noted, checking their list. "Railroad prices," Mr. Peterson said shortly. "Everything costs more with them controlling the supply lines." Bear's expression darkened, but he said nothing. They finished their trading in silence, loaded their purchases, and turned the wagon toward home. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when they finally crested the last rise before the homestead. Something was wrong. Hattie May felt it before she saw it, a thickness in the air, like before a storm. Then she spotted the horses tied outside their house, the sheriff's bay mare and two sleek Eastern-bred stallions she didn't recognize. Bear's hand tightened on the wagon seat. "Steady now," he murmured. "Let's see what's what before we worry." They found Martha Carter in the kitchen, her face streaked with tears. Papers were scattered across the rough wooden table. Sheriff Dunn stood by the window, his badge catching the late sunlight, while two well-dressed men in city boots occupied the best chairs. "There you are finally," Martha snapped, but her voice trembled. These men have papers, about our land." The taller of the two strangers stood, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Silas Kettering, Railroad Land Office," he announced smoothly. "And you must be the girl we've heard about. The one who bought herself a mountain man." Bear moved slightly, placing himself between Kettering and Hattie May. "What's this about?" "Progress, Mr. McCallum, the inevitable march of civilization." Kettering's smile never reached his eyes. "This tract falls within the new railway survey. The Carter family will, of course, be compensated at market value when they vacate." Vacate, Hattie Mae's voice cracked up, but this is our home. My pa built this house. Now, Sheriff Dunn interrupted. No need for hysterics, everything's legal and proper. Got the judge's seal right here. Bear picked up the papers, studying them in the fading light. His scarred fingers traced the lines carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. These surveys, he said finally, they're wrong. Kettering's smile tightened. I assure you, they're quite official. Didn't say they weren't official. Said they were wrong. Bear laid the papers down carefully. Seen this before, up Montana way. Railroad men with clean hands and dirty papers, pushing families off their land with forged surveys and bought judges. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun belt. That's a serious accusation, McCallum. Truth often is. Bear's voice remained steady. These markers they're claiming? They're off by half a mile. Land office in Denver would spot it right quick if anyone bothered to check. Kettering's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, showing something cold underneath. The railroad's claim is ironclad. You have 1 week to clear out, or the sheriff here will assist in your removal. He stood, gathering his papers. Good evening, Mrs. Carter. Miss Carter, come along, Thompson. The second man, who hadn't spoken, followed Kettering out. Sheriff Dunn lingered, looking uncomfortable. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said finally. Railroad's coming whether we like it or not. Best just to take their money and find new ground. After they'd gone, Martha collapsed into a chair, sobbing. What are we going to do? Where can we go? Bear began building up the fire, his movements deliberate. We're not going anywhere. Don't be foolish, Martha snapped, and you heard them, they've got the law on their side. They've got lies on their side, Bear corrected, setting the kettle to boil. And money and men with guns, but we've got something better. He looked at Hattie Mae. We've got truth. And God's grace. And each other. Each other? Martha laughed bitterly. A worn-out woman, 2 useless boys, a mountain murderer, and she waved dismissively at Hattie Mae. And your stepdaughter, Bear finished, his voice like granite. Who's got more spine than the whole town put together? He began laying out cups for coffee. Here's what we'll do. First, we send word to the land office in Denver. I know a man there, honest fellow, who'll look at those surveys proper. Then we talk to the neighbors, Phillips family, old Weber, the Hansons. Railroad's probably trying the same game with them. They won't listen, Martha protested. Nobody in town will stand with us. Don't need the whole town. Just need enough folks to make noise. Get the territorial paper involved. Make it harder for them to bury the truth. Bear poured coffee with steady hands. Meanwhile, we strengthen the house. Fix those shutters. Reinforce the door. Make it clear we're not running. Hattie Mae's heart beat faster as she listened. This was madness. Standing against the railroad, against the sheriff himself. And yet, something inside her thrilled to the idea. For the first time in her life, someone was suggesting she fight back instead of giving in. They'll hurt us, Martha whispered. They'll try, Bear agreed calmly. But I've lived wild 15 years, ma'am. Survived mountain winters and Apache summers. Man like Kettering, he's used to folks backing down. Doesn't know what to do with people who stand their ground. The lamp flickered as night settled in. Martha went to bed still weeping, but Hattie Mae stayed at the table, watching Bear clean his rifle with methodical care. Did you mean it, she asked finally, about helping us fight? Bear looked up, his scarred face serious in the lamplight. Made you a promise, Miss Hattie Mae. Day you bought my contract, you bought my loyalty too. Won't let them drive you from your father's land. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Why risk everything for us? Bear was quiet for a long moment, his hands still moving over the rifle. Because someone needs to stand against men like Kettering. Because this land was your pa's dream, and dreams matter. Because you showed mercy to a stranger, and that creates a debt that can't be measured in dollars. He met her eyes. And because sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't understand His purpose at first. Hattie Mae felt tears welling up, but these weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of something else, something that felt like hope, like strength, like the first whispers of dawn after a long night. I'm scared, she admitted. Good. Bear nodded approvingly. Scared keeps you sharp, keeps you thinking, but scared ain't the same as weak. and it sure ain't the same as beaten. He finished with the rifle and set it carefully aside. Get some sleep, Miss Hattie Mae. Tomorrow we start planning proper. The lamp cast long shadows on the wall as Hattie Mae climbed the stairs to her room. She could hear her stepmother's muffled sobs from down the hall, the soft creak of Bear's boots as he made one last check of the house. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the darkened valley. Her father's land, her home, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of leaving to his children. The railroad men thought they could take it with their fancy papers and false surveys. They thought no one would stand against them. Not a worn-out widow, not two lazy boys, not an overweight girl that nobody respected. But they hadn't counted on Bear, hadn't counted on his quiet strength, his stubborn loyalty, his unshakable faith that right could triumph over might. And maybe, just maybe, they hadn't counted on Hattie Mae herself. On the steel that Bear saw in her spine. The courage she was only just beginning to discover. She knelt by her bed to pray the way her father had taught her. Lord, she whispered, give us strength for what's coming. Help us stand firm. And thank you. Thank you for sending Bear to help us fight. Below, she heard the soft murmur of Bear's voice as he too offered his evening prayers. Two souls joined in faith, preparing for battle, trusting in something stronger than railroad money or legal tricks. Tomorrow would bring its own trials. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, Hattie Mae felt the first stirrings of real hope. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in watercolor hues as Bear and Hattie Mae rode out from the homestead. The morning air still held its crispness, though the August sun promised another scorching day ahead. Bear led them on his sturdy mountain horse, while Hattie Mae followed on her father's old mare, her hands tight on the reins. First stop's the mission church, Bear explained, his voice carrying back on the breeze. Reverend Black Fox knows more about land rights than any man I've met. Hattie Mae nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. She'd seen the Cherokee preacher in town sometimes, always dignified in his black coat, but had never spoken to him. Will he help us? He helps those who seek justice, Bear answered simply. That's what we're doing. The mission church sat in a small valley, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the morning light. A handful of graves marked the hillside behind it, their wooden crosses weathered but tended with care. As they approached, a tall figure emerged from the chapel door, Reverend Elijah Black Fox, his dark eyes keen beneath silver-streaked hair. Brother Bear, he called warmly, raising a hand in greeting. I had a feeling I might see you soon. His gaze shifted to Hattie Mae. And Miss Carter. Welcome to God's house. Bear dismounted smoothly, then helped Hattie Mae from her saddle. She felt clumsy next to his fluid grace, but the Reverend's smile held nothing but kindness. Railroad men came yesterday, Bear said without preamble, claiming Carter land for their new line, got papers that don't match any honest survey I've ever seen. Reverend Black Fox's expression grew serious. Come inside, he said. There are things you should see. The chapel interior was cool and dim, smelling of pine wood and beeswax candles. The Reverend led them to a small office behind the pulpit, where a heavy iron strongbox sat beneath his desk. From it, he withdrew a collection of carefully preserved documents. Treaties, he explained, spreading them across the desk. Government surveys. Land office records. I've kept them safe for years, knowing this day would come. His fingers traced lines of faded ink. The railroad has been stealing land all across the territory using false surveys and corrupted officials. But they made a mistake here. Bear leaned forward, studying the papers. How so? These treaties mark the old Cherokee hunting grounds. The government's own surveyors mapped them precisely. Reverend Black Fox overlaid 2 maps. See where the railroad claims their right-of-way should be? It crosses land that was never officially ceded. Their entire claim rests on fraudulent documents. Hattie Mae peered at the maps, trying to understand. But will that help us? We're not Cherokee. Truth helps everyone, child, the Reverend said gently. These papers prove the railroad is lying. And lies, even when wrapped in legal language, are still lies in God's eyes. Bear nodded slowly. We'll need copies. Already prepared them. Reverend Black Fox retrieved a leather portfolio. I've been expecting trouble since the railroad started buying judges in Denver. Take these to the territorial paper in Colorado Springs. And this, he handed Bear a sealed letter, will reach a friend at the land office who still values honesty over bribes. They left the mission church with hope burning brighter in their hearts. Their next stop lay several miles west, the Martinez homestead, where smoke rose thin against the morning sky. Doña Rosa met them at her gate, her black dress dusty from work, her face lined with worry, but her spine straight as a ramrod. "Bear McCallum," she said, nodding. "And the Carter girl. You've come about the railroad, yes?" "Word travels fast," Bear commented. "Fast as poison," Rosa agreed grimly. "Come see what their men did to my well." She led them to the stone-lined well that served her small farm. The water within had a sickly sheen, and a foul smell rose from its depths. "Did this 3 nights ago," Rosa explained. "Thought they could drive me out by destroying my water. But I was born in Sonora, where we learned to survive worse than railroad thugs." Her dark eyes flashed. "My Manuel died defending this land. I won't dishonor his memory by running." Bear squatted by the well, examining the damage. "Can be cleaned with work. Might take weeks, but it can be done." "I have weeks," Rosa said firmly. "What I don't have is patience for men who think they can steal what isn't theirs." She turned to Hattie Mae. "Your father was a good man, Nina. He helped dig this well when Manuel took sick. Now I'll help you defend his land, Aquarius." They shared a simple meal of beans and tortillas in Rosa's kitchen, planning their next moves. The widow's knowledge of local families proved invaluable. Who might stand with them, who had already sold out to the railroad, who could be trusted to carry messages. The ride home took them past the Peterson place, abandoned now to wind and weeds. The sight of its empty windows and sagging porch made Hattie Mae's throat tight. Just last spring, she'd visited here for a quilting bee. Now the family was gone, driven out by railroad money and threats. "It ain't right," she whispered. "No," Bear agreed. "It ain't. But that's why we fight, so it doesn't happen again." The sun was settling toward the mountains when they reached their own homestead. Bear didn't head for the barn, though. Instead, he guided them to a small meadow behind the house. "Time for your next lesson," he said, dismounting. From his saddlebag, he drew a worn Colt single-action army revolver. Every person should know how to defend themselves. But first, he fixed Hattie Mae with a serious look. "You need to understand something. True strength ain't in bullets, it's in here." He tapped his chest. "In courage, in faith, in knowing what's right and standing firm." Hattie Mae nodded, her heart pounding as he placed the heavy revolver in her hands. "I understand." "Good. Now stance like this." He positioned her carefully, adjusting her grip. "Breathe steady. Focus on your target, that old stump there. When you're ready, squeeze gentle. Don't pull." The report cracked across the meadow, startling birds from the trees. Hattie Mae's shot went wide, but Bear nodded approvingly. "Good start again." They practiced until the light began to fade, Bear's quiet instructions helping Hattie Mae improve with each shot. By the end, she'd hit the stump twice, and her hands had stopped shaking. "Enough for today," Bear said finally. "Let's get some supper." In the kitchen, Rosa's teachings proved useful as Hattie Mae prepared a hearty stew. They ate by lamplight, talking over the day's events and tomorrow's plans. Bear seemed different somehow, more alive, more present, as if their mission had awakened something long dormant in him. "I never thought I could do any of this," Hattie Mae admitted softly. "Standing up to the railroad, learning to shoot, making plans. Always figured I was just useless." "You ain't never been useless," Bear said firmly. "Just needed a chance to prove it. To yourself most of all." Something in his voice made her look up. There in the lamplight, she saw it. A smile. Small and weathered. Like everything about Bear, but real. It transformed his scarred face, softening the hard lines, showing the man he might have been before life turned him harsh. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping us fight, for teaching me, for everything." Bear's smile deepened just a fraction. "You gave me mercy when I deserved none? Showing you your own strength is the least I can do in return." Outside, crickets sang their evening chorus. Inside, the lamp cast warm light on two people who had found, in each other, something they'd thought lost forever: purpose and hope, and the courage to stand against injustice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had this moment of quiet victory, of knowing they weren't alone in the fight ahead. The late summer sun painted long shadows across the homestead as dawn broke over the Colorado mountains. Hattie Mae wiped sweat from her brow, hefting another bucket of water from the well. Bear worked steadily beside her, his massive frame making the heavy task look effortless. They had fallen into an easy rhythm over the past weeks, rising early, sharing a simple breakfast, then tackling the endless work that kept the ranch alive. "Reckon that's enough water for now," Bear said, setting down his buckets. "Fence line needs mending on the north pasture." Hattie Mae nodded, feeling pride in her strengthening arms. Where once such labor had left her winded and ashamed, now she moved with growing confidence. Bear never rushed her, never mocked her size or pace. He simply worked alongside her, teaching through quiet example. The morning passed in comfortable silence as they repaired broken fence posts and stretched new wire. Around midday, they spotted a rider approaching from town. The stranger sat straight in his saddle despite missing his left arm, his weather-beaten hat pulled low against the sun. "Name's Silas Boone," he announced, reining his horse to a stop. "Heard tell you folks are standing up to them railroad men." Bear straightened slowly, studying the newcomer. Word travels fast. Faster than a rattler's strike when justice is concerned. Silas dismounted awkwardly, compensating for his missing arm. Served with the 7th Kansas Cavalry at Shiloh. Lost this arm there, fighting for what's right. Now I see these railroad vultures stealing land from honest folk and my trigger finger gets mighty itchy. "We ain't looking for gunplay," Bear warned. Silas smiled grimly. "Neither was I back in '62, but sometimes a man's gotta stand for something." He turned to Hattie Mae. "Miss Carter, I reckon. Heard what you did at that auction. Takes real grit to show mercy when everyone's calling for blood." Hattie Mae blushed, unused to praise, just seemed right as all. Right is exactly what it was. Silas leaned against the fence post. "I've been drifting, taking odd jobs here and there. Tired of watching good people get pushed around. Thought maybe you could use another pair of hands. Well, one hand, anyway." His laugh was rough but genuine. Bear and Hattie Mae exchanged glances. Finally, Bear nodded. "Could use help with the harvest coming on? You know ranch work? Grew up on a farm in Kansas before the war. Can't rope like I used to, but I'm handy with tools and I learn quick." "Welcome aboard then," Bear said simply. As the days lengthened into weeks, Silas proved his worth many times over. His one-armed carpentry might have been slower, but his work was solid. In the evenings, he would often pull out his fiddle, playing old war songs and trail ballads that echoed across the darkening prairie. After supper each night, Bear would spread legal papers across the kitchen table, teaching Hattie Mae to understand their dense language. "Knowledge is protection," he would say, helping her sound out the complex words. "Can't fight what you don't understand." She proved an eager student, surprising herself with how quickly she grasped the concepts. Treaties, land grants, mineral rights. Gradually, the mysterious documents began making sense. Bear nodded approvingly as she explained a particularly tricky clause one evening. "You've got a good head for this," he said, "better than most lawyers I've known." The community began to change too. Neighbors who had once hurried past now stopped to talk, offering eggs or preserves, asking about the railroad fight. Word spread about Bear's gentle guidance and Hattie Mae's growing confidence. Even her stepmother's bitter comments seemed to lose their sting. One Sunday morning, the little church was packed full. Hattie Mae sat between Bear and Silas, trying to make herself small as always. When the hymns began, she barely whispered the words. But Bear's deep bass rumbled encouragingly beside her, and Silas's clear tenor rang out strong. Gradually, her voice grew stronger, blending with the congregation. After the service, people gathered outside in the August sunshine. Bear's hand settled protective on Hattie Mae's shoulder as neighbors approached. "This here's the young lady who bought me with mercy," he announced proudly. A few chuckles started, but died quickly at his serious expression. "She saw worth where others saw only threat. Reckon that's what the good book calls wisdom." Hattie Mae felt warmth spread through her chest as she watched people's expressions change. Where once she had seen mockery and dismissal, now she glimpsed something like respect. Mrs. Peterson, who had always turned away before, actually smiled and asked about the ranch. Mr. Johnson, the banker, tipped his hat to her. Even the sheriff nodded gravely. That evening, Hattie Mae sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Bear settled beside her, his bulk making the wood creak. "Penny for your thoughts," he said quietly. "Just thinking how different everything is," she replied. "Few months ago I could barely look folks in the eye. Now they're coming to us for help against the railroad. Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming it all." "Ain't no dream, you had this strength in you all along, just needed someone to believe in it." Bear's voice was gentle. "You showed me mercy when you didn't have to. Now you're showing everyone what real leadership looks like. Not bullying and threats, but bringing folks together for what's right." From inside came the sweet notes of Silas's fiddle, playing a peaceful evening tune. Chickens clucked softly in their coop, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Hattie Mae's world had indeed expanded, growing from a narrow space of shame and mockery into something rich with possibility. "Reckon we've got more fights ahead," she said thoughtfully. "Reckon we do," Bear agreed, "but we'll face them together with truth and courage on our side." The twilight deepened around them as they sat in comfortable silence, while Silas's music floated on the evening breeze. Where once Hattie Mae had felt trapped and alone, now she felt surrounded by strength. Not just her own growing confidence, but the strength of community, of chosen family, of people standing together for what was right. Through the open door, she could see the legal papers spread across the kitchen table, waiting for tomorrow's lesson. On the wall hung Bear's revolver, cleaned and ready. Out in the barn, Silas's saddle sat beside fresh-cut lumber for repairs. All around her were signs of the new life she had stumbled into that day at the auction block, when one small act of mercy had changed everything. Late August brought a different rhythm to the ranch. Golden wheat rippled in the morning breeze as Bear studied the fields, his experienced eye gauging the perfect moment for harvest. The sun had barely crested the eastern hills when he gathered everyone in the kitchen. "Time's right," he announced, spreading a rough map across the table. "Wheat's ready in the north field. Potatoes need digging in the south patch. Got to work smart, not just hard." Hattie Mae listened intently as Bear laid out the day's plan. Gone was her old hesitation. Now she took notes and asked clear questions about timing and tools. Silas tapped the map with his good hand, suggesting the best approach for the potato field. They started with the wheat. Bear demonstrated the proper swing of the scythe, his powerful arms making the motion look effortless. "Keep your back straight," he instructed Hattie Mae. "Let the blade do the work." Her first attempts were awkward, but Bear's patient guidance helped her find the rhythm. Soon she was moving steadily through the golden stalks, satisfaction growing with each clean cut. Sweat darkened her dress, but she didn't mind. This was honest work, purposeful work. Mid-morning brought unexpected help. The Petersons arrived first, then the Johnsons, and soon half a dozen families were spread across the field. Men swung scythes while women and children gathered sheaves. Even Reverend Elijah appeared, his black coat replaced by simple work clothes. "The Lord helps those who help each other," he said with a smile, picking up a pitchfork. The work was hard, but shared stories and laughter made it lighter. Women passed water jugs and children darted between the workers with messages. Even Hattie Mae's stepmother joined in, her usual sharp tongue softened by the community spirit. By afternoon, they moved to the potato field. Bear showed Hattie Mae how to judge the plant's readiness. "See how the tops are yellowing? That's your sign." He demonstrated the careful way to loosen the soil without damaging the tubers below. Children squealed with delight as they unearthed the buried treasures, competing to find the largest potato. Silas organized them into teams, making a game of filling the baskets. His warm laugh and encouragement turned work into play. The sun was low when Doña Rosa arrived with her daughters, bringing huge pots of beans and tortillas. Other families had brought food too: fried chicken, cornbread, apple pies. Bear and Silas strung lanterns between the fence posts, creating a warm circle of light in the gathering dusk. "Time to celebrate God's bounty," Reverend Elijah declared, blessing the food. Tables appeared from wagons, forming a long line in the yard. Everyone gathered, dirty and tired but happy, passing dishes and sharing the day's victories. Hattie Mae found herself at the center, accepting compliments on the harvest and the ranch's improvement. "You've done your daddy proud, Miss Hattie," Mrs. Peterson said warmly, and Hattie Mae felt her heart swell at the respectful title. After supper, Silas pulled out his fiddle. Mr. Johnson produced a harmonica, and soon music filled the evening air. Children clapped along as the adults cleared a space for dancing. "Come on, Bear," Silas called. "Show us some steps." The big man shook his head, but the children's pleading finally won him over. He stepped into the circle, attempting a stiff-legged jig that set everyone laughing. His serious expression only made it funnier until even Bear cracked a smile. Hattie Mae watched from her seat, joy bubbling up inside her. Here was her land, her community, coming together in celebration. She saw respect in their eyes when they called her Miss Hattie. Not mockery, but genuine regard. Even her stepbrothers had stopped their teasing, instead asking her advice about ranch matters. Later, as families began heading home with promises to return for tomorrow's work, Bear settled beside her near the dying fire. The lantern light caught the silver in his beard as he stared into the flames. "Been thinking," he said slowly. "Spent 20 years in the mountains running from people, from myself. Never thought I'd find peace. But here, working this land with good folks, teaching you what I know." He paused, searching for words. "Reckon I've found something I didn't even know I was missing." Hattie Mae understood. The ranch had transformed them both. Him from a feared outcast to a respected leader. Her from a mocked girl to a capable young woman. Together, they had built something precious. The evening settled soft around them. Silas played quiet tunes while helping stack the empty plates. A few lanterns still swayed in the breeze, casting warm pools of light across the yard. From the fields came the peaceful sounds of nightbirds, and the air carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut wheat. Hattie Mae breathed it all in, the satisfaction of good work completed, the warmth of community, the blessing of belonging. For this moment, everything felt right with the world. The railroad threat seemed distant, overwhelmed by the power of people standing together, sharing strength and purpose. She looked around at her home, the solid barn Bear had repaired, the neat rows of harvested wheat, the well-tended gardens. More than the physical improvements, she saw the changes in the people, neighbors who now stopped to chat instead of hurrying past, children who begged for Bear's stories instead of running away, her own family, gradually knitting back together around this new core of respect and cooperation. Bear stood, his massive frame silhouetted against the stars. Best get some rest. Still got work tomorrow. But his tone was content, peaceful. This was no longer just labor to survive. It was the shared work of building something meaningful. Hattie Mae nodded, gathering herself to help with the final cleanup. The night wrapped around the ranch like a gentle blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, all was well. The harvest was in, the community was strong, and hope bloomed as bright as the lanterns swaying in the summer breeze. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold. Hattie Mae stood on the porch, savoring the peaceful morning after yesterday's joyous harvest celebration. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen where Bear was already up, preparing for another day of work. The thunder of hooves shattered the quiet. "Fire! Fire at Rosa's place," a rider galloped past, his voice cracking with urgency. Bear burst through the door, rifle in hand. "Get the wagon ready," he commanded, already running for the barn. Hattie Mae's hands shook as she hitched the horses. Through the morning haze, she could see black smoke rising from the direction of Doña Rosa's homestead. Her heart pounded against her ribs as Bear loaded water barrels into the wagon. They weren't the only ones responding. Other neighbors were already on the road, wagons and riders converging on Rosa's property. But as they crested the final hill, Hattie Mae's breath caught in her throat. Flames engulfed the small adobe house. Railroad men on horseback circled the property like vultures, their faces hidden beneath bandanas. Rosa and her children huddled by the well, watching their home burn. "Keep back," one of the riders warned, brandishing a pistol. Bear's voice carried across the yard. "Let us help or there won't be anything left." The railroad men exchanged glances, then slowly backed their horses away. The community surged forward with buckets and blankets, forming a water line from the well. But the flames were too fierce, too well set. The heat drove them back again and again. Hattie Mae found Rosa in the chaos and pulled her close. The older woman's body shook with sobs as she watched a lifetime of memories turn to ash. Her children clung to her skirts, faces streaked with tears and soot. "Mi casa," Rosa whispered. "Everything we built." The morning sun rose higher as they fought the fire, but nothing could save the house. By mid-morning, only smoking ruins remained. The railroad men had long since disappeared, leaving destruction in their wake. Reverend Elijah arrived as they were salvaging what little they could from the rubble. His normally calm face was tight with anger as he surveyed the scene. "This is not justice," he declared, helping to retrieve a scorched family Bible from the ashes. "This is the work of men who fear the truth." They were still working to secure what remained of Rosa's belongings when horses approached again. This time it was Sheriff Dunn with 2 deputies. The lawman's face was granite hard as he dismounted. "Reverend Elijah Blackfox," he announced formally. "You're under arrest for inciting unrest and interfering with railroad business." A shocked murmur ran through the gathered neighbors. Reverend Elijah stood slowly, dignity in every movement. "I have only preached the truth, Sheriff. God's word and man's law both speak against theft and destruction." "Save it for the judge." The sheriff nodded to his deputies, who moved to shackle the preacher's wrists. Hattie Mae stepped forward. "You can't do this. He's done nothing wrong." "Stay out of this, girl," Sheriff Dunn warned. "You've caused enough trouble already with that mountain man of yours." The deputies led Reverend Elijah to their horses. He turned to address the stunned crowd. "Keep faith," he called. "The Lord sees all things. Truth cannot be chained." They watched helplessly as the lawmen rode away with their trusted preacher. Rosa gripped Hattie Mae's hand, both women fighting tears. Bear stood apart, his expression dark as storm clouds. The day grew heavy with whispers and fears. Neighbors who had celebrated with them yesterday now hurried past with averted eyes. In town, Hattie Mae heard the gossip turning poison sharp. Bear was behind it all, they said, stirring up peaceful folks against progress, leading them to ruin. Evening shadows were stretching across the yard when more riders appeared. Sheriff Dunn had returned, this time with 6 deputies and railroad agent Kettering himself. "Bear McCallum," the sheriff called out. "You're under arrest for the murder of James Whitaker, 19 years ago in the Montana Territory." Bear stood in the doorway, massive frame filling it. "That was self-defense, Sheriff. Man tried to kill me for a gold claim. Every lawman north of Denver knows it." "New evidence has come to light," Kettering smiled thinly, producing papers from his coat. "Witnesses have stepped forward. You'll hang this time, McCallum." Hattie Mae rushed forward as the deputies approached with chains. "And no, you can't take him. He's changed. He's a good man." Bear caught her shoulders gently. "Stay strong, girl. Remember what I taught you about reading those papers, about standing your ground." His voice dropped lower. "Truth will out if we keep faith." The sheriff's men surrounded Bear, weapons ready, but he offered no resistance as they shackled his wrists and ankles. The heavy chains seemed wrong on him, like seeing a proud eagle caged. "Your dollar bought you trouble, girl," Sheriff Dunn said as they led Bear away. "Should have let sleeping dogs lie." Hattie Mae stood in the gathering dusk watching them take her protector, her teacher, her friend. The ranch felt suddenly empty, vulnerable. All their work, their dreams of justice, seemed to crumble like Rosa's burned home. She sank to her knees in the yard, shoulders shaking with sobs. First Rosa's home destroyed, then Reverend Elijah arrested on lies, and now Bear, taken away in chains like the day she'd first seen him. But this time there would be no silver dollar to save him. The sound of boots on dirt made her look up. Rosa stood there, face still smudged with ash from her ruined home. The older woman knelt beside her, drawing her into an embrace that smelled of smoke and tears. "No llores, mi hija," Rosa whispered. "Do not cry. They think if they break our hearts, they break our spirit. But we are stronger than they know." The stars emerged one by one above them, watching over a homestead that had known such joy just yesterday, now silent except for the sound of grief. But in that grief, something else was being born. A determination that would not be broken by fire or chains or fear. The ranch lay quiet under the rising moon. The lanterns that had lit yesterday's celebration were dark, but the seeds of resistance Bear had planted, in the land, in the community, and in Hattie Mae's heart, remained. They would grow stronger in the face of adversity, nourished by truth and justice, waiting for their time to bloom. The kerosene lamp cast wavering shadows across the kitchen walls as Hattie Mae paced back and forth, her boots scuffed against the worn floorboards, each step heavy with worry. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. "You're wearing a track in my floor, girl," her stepmother said from the doorway, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Come to bed. There's nothing to be done tonight." Hattie Mae shook her head, her hands clasped tightly. "I can't sleep. Not with Bear in that jail cell, not with Reverend Elijah locked up too." "Best forget about that mountain man," her stepmother advised, voice sharp with disapproval. "Railroad's offering fair price for the land. We should take it and count ourselves lucky." "Lucky?" Hattie Mae turned, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "They burned Rose's home. They arrested good people on lies. There's nothing lucky about being pushed off our land." Her stepmother's face hardened. "That's the way of things. Small folk can't fight the railroad. Your papa knew that before he passed. Why do you think he never signed those ownership papers proper?" "Because he was sick," Hattie Mae protested. "Because he trusted family to do right by his daughter." "Well, family's telling you now, let it go. That dollar of yours has brought nothing but trouble." Hattie Mae gripped the back of a kitchen chair, steadying herself. "That dollar bought me the first person who ever saw me as something more than just a burden. Bear believes in me. He taught me to believe in myself." "And where's that got him?" Her stepmother shook her head. "Back in chains, headed for the gallows most like. Is that what you want? More blood on your conscience?" The lamp flame guttered as a night breeze slipped through the window. Hattie Mae watched the shadows dance, remembering Bear's quiet strength, his patient teachings, his faith in justice. "I won't give up," she said softly. "Not on Bear. Not on the land. Not on what's right." Her stepmother threw up her hands. "Then you're a fool, girl. Just like your father was." She turned and stalked away, leaving Hattie Mae alone with the flickering lamplight and her resolve. Dawn painted the eastern sky pink as Hattie Mae saddled her horse. Her hands moved surely over the leather straps, just as Bear had taught her. The morning air held autumn's first chill, but her determination burned warm in her chest. The ride into town seemed longer than usual. Every hoofbeat echoed with memories. Bear teaching her to post properly in the saddle, praising her natural seat, telling her she had a way with horses that came from her gentle heart. As she approached the town square, whispers and stares followed her progress. Women gathered their skirts and hurried past. Men stopped their conversations to watch with hard eyes. Children who had danced at their harvest celebration now scurried away at their mother's calls. "There goes trouble," someone muttered as she dismounted. "Ought to be ashamed," another voice added. Hattie Mae kept her chin up, though her heart pounded. Bear's words echoed in her mind. "Stand tall, girl. You've got more steel in your spine than the lot of them." The jailhouse squatted at the end of the street, its windows barred and uninviting. Deputy Wilson sat outside, whittling a stick and pretending not to notice her approach. "I've come to see Bear McCallum," she announced, proud that her voice didn't shake. The deputy looked up slowly. "Ain't visiting hours." "Please," Hattie Mae said. "Just 5 minutes. He's still my responsibility by law." Deputy Wilson spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Reckon that law don't mean much now he's facing murder charges." But he stood, fishing out his key ring. 5 minutes. No more. The cell block was dark and damp. Bear's massive frame occupied the last cell, his shoulders hunched in the confined space. When he turned at their approach, Hattie Mae gasped. Purple bruises mottled his face and dried blood crusted his beard. "What happened to him?" she demanded. "Resisted during exercise period," Deputy Wilson said flatly. "Had to be subdued." Bear's eyes met hers through the bars. "Don't fret, girl. I've had worse." The deputy unlocked the cell door. 5 minutes, he repeated, then retreated to his post. Hattie Mae rushed forward, reaching through the bars to touch Bear's bruised face. "Oh, Bear. What did they do to you?" "Nothing that matters." His voice was steady, though he winced at her touch. "How are you holding up?" "They want me to give up," she whispered, "to sell the land and forget everything we built." Bear's large hand covered hers where it rested on the cell bar. "And what do you want?" "I want to fight, but I'm scared. Everyone's against us now. Even my own family says I'm foolish." "Fear's natural," Bear said quietly. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." Tears welled in Hattie Mae's eyes. "How can I fight the railroad alone? I'm just one girl." "You're not just anything," Bear growled. "You're the bravest soul I know. Remember when you bid that dollar? Everyone laughing, mocking, but you stood your ground. That same courage is still in you." "Time's up," Deputy Wilson called, and Bear squeezed her hand. "Don't despair, child. Truth has a way of coming to light. Keep faith, like Reverend Elijah taught us." Hattie Mae nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll find a way to help you. Both of you. I promise. I know you will." Bear's smile was gentle despite his bruises. "Now go on. Stand tall." The ride home felt heavier than the journey in. Hattie Mae's heart ached with each step of her horse. The sight of Bear's bruises, the memory of his gentle encouragement despite his own pain, filled her thoughts. When she reached the ranch, she couldn't bear to go inside. Instead, she led her horse to the barn, seeking solitude in its familiar shadows. The smell of hay and leather surrounded her as she sank to her knees in an empty stall. "Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to do. Show me the way. Give me strength." Tears fell freely now, soaking into the fresh hay. She cried for Bear's suffering, for Rosa's lost home, for Reverend Elijah's unjust imprisonment. She cried for her own fear and uncertainty. But as the afternoon light slanted through the barn board, something shifted in her heart. The tears slowly ceased. Her breathing steadied. She remembered Bear teaching her to read legal documents, showing her how truth could be found in the careful study of words. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen. The lamp burned low as she carefully composed her letter to Judge Harrison, the circuit judge who would hear Bear's case. "Dear Your Honor," she wrote, her penmanship careful and clear as Bear had taught her. "I write to you about a grave injustice. The man known as Bear McCallum is accused of murder, but I know him as a man of peace and principle." She wrote of his gentle teaching, his respect for the law, his defense of those who couldn't defend themselves. She detailed the railroad's tactics, the burned homes, the false arrests, the corruption that tainted local justice. "I know this letter may never reach your hands," she concluded, "but I must try. An innocent man's life hangs in the balance. I ask only that truth be heard." Setting down her pen, Hattie Mae looked at the pages before her. The words seemed small against the weight of railroad money and influence, yet Bear's voice echoed in her memory. Truth cannot be silenced forever. She sealed the letter carefully, then added it to her saddlebag for tomorrow's ride to the post office. Whether it would help or not, she had to act, had to keep fighting. Outside, coyotes called in the distance. The autumn wind whispered through the fence rails Bear had helped her repair. Somewhere in town, he sat in a dark cell, believing in her when everyone else had turned away. Hattie Mae straightened her shoulders, feeling the steel in her spine that Bear had always seen. She might be afraid, but she would not give up. Not on Bear, not on justice, not on the truth that burned in her heart. 2 days after sending her letter, Hattie Mae stood in the pre-dawn darkness, checking the straps on her horse's saddle. The leather creaked beneath her fingers as she tightened each buckle with trembling hands. Her traveling dress, freshly pressed the night before, already felt damp with nervous perspiration. Silas Boone rode up on his bay mare, his empty sleeve pinned neatly at his shoulder. "Ready to ride, Miss Hattie?" His voice carried the gentle strength she'd come to rely on these past weeks. "Ready as I'll ever be," she answered, swinging into her saddle. The morning air held a sharp chill that made her pull her shawl tighter. They set out as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky. The road to the county seat stretched before them like a dusty ribbon, winding through valleys and over hills. Hattie Mae's horse fell into step beside Silas's mare, their hooves raising small clouds in the morning stillness. 30 miles to cover," Silas said, adjusting his reins one-handed. "We'll make camp tonight and reach town by tomorrow afternoon. Hattie Mae nodded, her throat too tight for words. She thought of Bear in his cell, waiting for trial, believing in her when so many others had turned away. The weight of that trust pressed heavy on her heart. As the sun climbed higher, they passed other travelers on the road. Some nodded greeting, while others stared openly at the odd pair, a one-armed veteran and a stout young woman riding alone. Hattie Mae kept her chin high, remembering Bear's words about dignity. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a creek. Silas shared bread and dried beef from his saddlebags, settling his lanky frame against a sun-warmed rock. "Reminds me of marching with the Union Army," he said, gazing at the distant hills. "Long days on dusty roads, never knowing what waited ahead." "Were you scared?" Hattie Mae asked, picking at her bread. "Terrified." Silas's weathered face creased in a smile. But fear didn't matter much. What mattered was doing what needed doing. The afternoon stretched long as they rode on. Hattie Mae's muscles ached from hours in the saddle, but she didn't complain. Each mile brought them closer to Bear's trial, closer to whatever justice, or injustice, awaited. As twilight gathered, they made camp in a small grove of cottonwoods. Silas built a fire one-handed with practiced ease, while Hattie Mae tended to the horses. The autumn night turned crisp as stars began pricking the darkening sky. "Tell me about the war," Hattie Mae said as they sat by the fire. "How did you keep going when everything seemed impossible?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, stirring the flames with a stick. "We fought for something bigger than ourselves," he finally said. "Freedom ain't never been given freely. It's won by folks willing to stand up when standing seems foolish." He rolled up his empty sleeve. "Lost this arm at Shiloh, thought my life was over. But then I realized, a man's worth ain't in how many arms he's got, but in what he does with what remains." Hattie Mae stared into the fire, thinking of Bear's scarred face, of Rosa's burned home, of Reverend Elijah in jail. "The railroad thinks they can just take whatever they want," she said softly. "They're used to folks backing down," Silas agreed. "But sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say no, one person with the courage to stand firm." The fire crackled between them as night deepened. Overhead, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, unchanged by human struggles below. Hattie Mae wrapped herself in her blanket, but sleep was long in coming. Morning brought heavy dew and aching muscles. They ate a cold breakfast and mounted up as dawn broke. The county seat lay ahead, and with each mile, Hattie Mae's anxiety grew. By early afternoon, they crested a hill and saw the town spread below them. It was larger than Hattie Mae's home settlement, with brick buildings and proper sidewalks. The courthouse dome rose above the other rooftops, gleaming white in the autumn sun. "There it is," Silas said quietly, "where Bear's fate will be decided." They rode down the main street past busy shops and offices. Hattie Mae felt eyes following them, heard the whispers start. News of Bear's trial had clearly spread. Groups of men stood talking on corners, and she caught fragments of conversation about that mountain killer and railroad interests. Outside the hotel, several well-dressed men in city suits lounged on the porch. Railroad agents, Hattie Mae knew at once, by their swagger and the way they watched her and Silas pass. One man smiled coldly, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Don't let them rattle you," Silas murmured as they rode past. "That's what they want." They found rooms at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Tate. The woman's eyes widened slightly at Hattie Mae's travel-stained appearance, but showed them to clean, simple rooms without comment. "Trial starts tomorrow morning," Silas said as they stood in the narrow hallway. "Best get some rest while you can." Alone in her room, Hattie Mae sank onto the narrow bed. The mattress was lumpy, the quilts thin, but she barely noticed. Her mind whirled with fears and doubts. What if her letter never reached the judge? What if the railroad's influence was too strong? What if she failed Bear? Failed everyone who was counting on her? She opened her traveling bag and took out her mother's old Bible. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling. Inside the cover, her mother's flowing script read, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart." Kneeling beside the bed, Hattie Mae bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm so afraid. But Bear taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. Please give me strength for tomorrow. Help me stand tall, even when my knees want to buckle." Through the thin walls, she could hear the bustle of the boarding house. Doors opening and closing, voices murmuring, footsteps on the stairs. Somewhere in this town, Bear waited in another cell. Somewhere, railroad men plotted their next moves. And somewhere, she hoped, truth and justice still held meaning. Rising from her knees, Hattie Mae went to the window. The street below was growing quiet as evening settled. A lamplighter moved from post to post, his torch bringing dots of brightness to the gathering dark. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. Tonight, she could only prepare her heart and pray for courage. Her dress hung on a hook pressed as best she could manage for tomorrow's trial. Her mother's cameo pin, the only piece of jewelry she owned, lay on the dresser. Simple things, but they would have to do. She wasn't here to impress anyone with finery. She was here for justice, here for Bear, here for everyone who had ever been pushed aside by money and power. The evening air drifted through her window, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Hattie Mae touched her mother's Bible, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it standing tall just as Bear had taught her. Morning sunlight streamed through tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The courtroom benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the county, packed shoulder to shoulder to witness Bear McCallum's trial. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and whispered speculation. Hattie Mae sat rigid in her wooden chair, her cotton dress feeling too tight around her neck. Beside her, Silas maintained a steady presence, his empty sleeve pinned neatly. Across the aisle, railroad men lounged with casual arrogance, their suits pristine and watches gleaming. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Hawthorne." Everyone stood as the judge entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. He was older than Hattie Mae expected, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense. He settled into his high-backed chair and surveyed the crowded room. "Be seated," he commanded. "The court will hear the case of the Territory versus Bear McCallum." The side door opened and Bear was let in, chains clinking. Hattie Mae's heart clenched at the sight of him. Though his beard was neatly trimmed and he wore clean clothes, the shackles seemed to mock his dignity. Yet, he held his head high, scanning the crowd until he found her face. The smallest nod passed between them. Railroad agent Silas Kettering rose first, his smile as polished as his boots. "Your Honor, the railroad brings serious charges against this man. Murder, theft, destruction of property, a litany of crimes that have terrorized the honest citizens." He gestured to a table where several items lay displayed. "We present evidence gathered over many months. This knife was found at the scene of Timothy Walsh's murder last spring. Witnesses will testify to seeing McCallum in the area." The knife gleamed dully, a common hunting blade, unremarkable except for a notched handle. Bear's face remained impassive, but Hattie Mae saw his hands tighten slightly. One by one, Kettering's witnesses took the stand. A freight clerk claimed he'd seen Bear threatening Walsh. A track worker described finding the knife. A land surveyor detailed mysterious fires and sabotage along the rail line. Each testimony felt rehearsed, too smooth, yet the judge listened intently while making notes. Hattie Mae's stomach churned as Kettering wove his web of accusations. He painted Bear as a savage, a monster who needed to be caged. The courtroom crowd muttered and nodded, accepting the railroad's story. And finally, Kettering declared, "We have this sworn statement from Sheriff Matthews detailing McCallum's violent resistance to arrest and subsequent escape attempts." The morning wore on, each piece of evidence adding weight to the charges. Hattie Mae watched the judge's face, trying to read his thoughts. Sometimes his brow furrowed at inconsistencies in testimony, but he revealed little. When the railroad rested its case, Bear's court-appointed lawyer rose. He was young and nervous, clearly overwhelmed by Kettering's professional prosecution. His defense seemed weak, focusing mainly on technical points about jurisdiction and procedure. "The defense calls Hattie Mae Carter," he announced finally, his voice cracking slightly. The room stirred as Hattie Mae stood. She felt every eye upon her as she made her way to the witness stand, her shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Someone snickered at her size, and another whispered something that made others laugh. The bailiff held out a Bible, Place your hand here and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God." "I do," Hattie Mae said, her voice smaller than she'd hoped. She settled into the chair, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. The young lawyer cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, please tell the court about your relationship with the accused." Hattie Mae took a deep breath, remembering Bear's lessons about dignity. "I purchased Mr. McCallum's labor contract at the sheriff's auction 3 months ago, paying $1 silver. And what has been his conduct since then? He has worked our land honestly and well. He's helped rebuild fences, tend crops, and teach me about—" Kettering interrupted, rising smoothly. "Your Honor, the girl's domestic arrangements hardly seem relevant to these serious charges." "I believe I'll decide what's relevant in my courtroom," Judge Hawthorne said firmly. "Continue, Miss Carter." Hattie Mae's voice grew stronger. "The murder Mr. Kettering speaks of, it happened on the 15th of May, but Bear couldn't have done it. He was with us that entire week, helping prepare our fields for planting." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Kettering's smile faltered slightly. "Are you certain of the date?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor, we had a late frost that week. Bear showed me how to protect the seedlings. He worked from sunrise to sunset, never leaving our land." The young lawyer gained confidence. "And the other accusations? The fires and sabotage? Half those dates he was helping neighboring farms. The whole town saw him. He's been nothing but honorable since the day I bought his contract." Hattie Mae's voice wavered, but held firm. "The dollar I spent bought not a beast but a man of honor?" The courtroom grew very quiet. Even the judge seemed struck by the simple dignity of her words. Kettering rose again, his face tight with controlled anger. "Miss Carter, you expect us to believe your testimony over multiple witnesses? A girl your age, defending a known criminal?" "I expect you to believe the truth," Hattie Mae replied. "Bear McCallum has shown more honor than those who forge documents to steal land, who burn homes and jail innocent preachers." "Objection," Kettering snapped. "This is slander." "Overruled," Judge Hawthorne said quietly. "Continue, Miss Carter." Hattie Mae's hands stopped shaking. She sat straighter, meeting Kettering's cold gaze. "The railroad wants our land. When we wouldn't sell, you started making trouble. But Bear taught me that standing up for truth matters more than being afraid." Kettering's cross-examination grew harsh. He tried to confuse her about dates, to make her doubt her memories. But Hattie Mae held firm, answering clearly and calmly. When he questioned her character, suggesting she was too young and simple to understand legal matters, something in her blazed up. "I may be young," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "but I know right from wrong. I know truth from lies, and I know that Bear McCallum is a good man who deserves justice." The crowd's mood had shifted. Where there had been mockery of her size and youth, now there were thoughtful faces, considering nods. Even some of the railroad men looked uncomfortable. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. "Miss Carter, do you understand the seriousness of these charges? Are you willing to stake your word and reputation on this man's character?" Hattie Mae met the judge's piercing gaze. "I am, Your Honor. Before God and this court, I swear that Bear McCallum is innocent of these charges. He's been falsely accused by men who care more for profit than truth." The judge studied her face for a long moment, then turned to Bear. "Mr. McCallum, do you have anything to add in your defense?" Bear stood slowly, chains rattling. His voice was quiet but clear. "Only this, Your Honor. That girl showed me mercy when no one else would. She trusted me when all saw was a beast. I've tried every day to be worthy of that trust." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hawthorne's quill scratched against paper as he made notes, the sound sharp in the heavy air. Hattie Mae returned to her seat, legs shaking but head high. Silas squeezed her hand once, wordlessly. The afternoon light had shifted to amber when Judge Hawthorne finally set down his quill. He surveyed the crowded room, his expression thoughtful. "This court has heard extensive testimony today," he began. "The railroad has presented what appears to be compelling evidence. Yet we have also heard witness to this man's character that cannot be ignored. I will need time to consider all aspects of this case before rendering judgment." He turned to Bear. "The defendant will remain in custody until this court reconvenes tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. As the bailiff led Bear away, his eyes met Hattie Mae's. In that brief moment, she saw something she'd never seen before. hope. The courtroom slowly emptied, boots scuffing on wooden floors, voices rising in discussion. Kettering and his men huddled near the door, their faces dark with frustration. But Hattie Mae barely noticed them. Her whole body trembled with the aftermath of courage, and her heart felt both heavy and light. "You did well," Silas said quietly as they walked out into the late afternoon sun. "Better than well. You spoke truth to power, girl, and made them listen." Hattie Mae nodded, unable to find words. She had done what needed doing, just as Bear had taught her. Now all they could do was pray that truth would prevail. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the county courthouse. Hattie Mae had barely slept, spending most of the night in prayer. Now she sat rigid in the wooden gallery, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles showed white. Around her, the courtroom filled quickly with spectators eager to hear the judge's decision. Bear was led in first, his chains rattling against the heavy silence. Though tired, he stood straight and dignified. His eyes found Hattie Mae's, and he gave her the slightest nod of encouragement. Judge Hawthorne entered, his black robe sweeping as he took his seat. Before rendering judgment, there are 2 additional witnesses who have come forward. Bailiff, bring in Reverend Blackfox. The doors opened and Reverend Elijah entered under guard. Despite his shackles, he walked with quiet grace, his Cherokee features composed. Railroad Agent Kettering shifted uneasily in his chair. "Reverend," the judge began, "I understand you have documents pertinent to this case." "Yes, Your Honor," Elijah's voice carried clearly. "For many years I have served as custodian of treaties and land records for both native and settler families in this territory." The bailiff removed his handcuffs and Elijah reached into his worn leather satchel. He withdrew a stack of yellowed papers, their edges crisp despite their age. "These are the original survey maps and property agreements from 1853, properly witnessed and sealed." Judge Hawthorne adjusted his spectacles as Elijah approached the bench. "And how did these documents come into your possession?" "The tribal council entrusted them to my predecessor, who passed them to me when I took up his ministry." Elijah's words were measured, dignified. "They show the true boundaries of all deeded properties in this county, including the Carter homestead." Kettering surged to his feet. "Your Honor, these alleged documents have no bearing on current railroad rights of way." "I believe they do," Elijah continued calmly, "because they prove the railroad never owned the land they claim to sell. The treaties show it belonged to the Cherokee Nation until being legally deeded to settler families. There was never any transfer to the railroad company." A railroad agent lunged forward suddenly, trying to snatch the papers from the judge's desk. The bailiff moved quickly, restraining him as Judge Hawthorne secured the documents. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. Hattie Mae's heart pounded as she watched Kettering's face darken with rage. "Furthermore," Elijah added, "I have here a letter from the Territorial Governor's office, dated last month, questioning the validity of recent railroad land claims." Judge Hawthorne studied the papers intently, his expression growing grave. "These appear authentic, complete with territorial seals and proper signatures." He looked up sharply. "Mr. Kettering, would you care to explain the discrepancy between these boundaries and those in your company's claims?" Before Kettering could respond, a commotion arose from the back of the courtroom. An elderly man with a prospector's beard was making his way forward, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. "Your Honor," he called out in a wavering voice, "I got something to say about Bear McCallum." "And you are?" the judge asked. "Name's Ezra Tate. Was a silver miner up Montana way back in '68. The old man's eyes were rheumy but clear. "That's when I met Bear McCallum, and I'm here to tell you about the man he's supposed to have killed." The courtroom fell silent. Hattie Mae held her breath as Ezra shuffled forward. "Jake Randall was my partner," the old miner continued. "We was working a claim when that big snowstorm hit. Bear McCallum found us half frozen in our cabin. He stayed 3 days, hunting food for us, keeping the fire going." Ezra's voice cracked. "Jake took sick with fever. Bear did what he could, but the cold was too much. Jake died in his sleep, natural as could be. Bear helped me bury him proper when the ground thawed." Tears streamed down the old man's weathered cheeks. "Been eating at me all these years, hearing folks blame Bear for murder. Jake Randall died from nature's hand, not violence. Bear McCallum saved my life in that storm. He's a good man." Hattie Mae couldn't hold back her own tears. They rolled freely down her face as she watched Bear bow his head, shoulders sagging with relief at this long-buried truth finally coming to light. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. "Mr. Tate, would you be willing to swear to this under oath?" "Already did, Your Honor. Signed and witnessed my statement at the sheriff's office this morning." Ezra straightened as much as his bent back would allow. "I'm an old man. Don't got much time left. Couldn't go to my grave without speaking truth for the man who saved me." The judge nodded slowly, then turned to Kettering. "Agent Kettering, these revelations cast serious doubt on both your land claims and the charges against McCallum. Do you have any response?" Kettering's smooth facade had cracked. His face was flushed with anger as he stood. "Your Honor, I protest this irregular proceeding. These are clearly desperate attempts to—" "To what, sir?" Judge Hawthorne interrupted sharply. "To prevent a grave miscarriage of justice? To expose what appears to be systematic fraud?" The judge shuffled through the papers before him, his expression hardening. "I have here evidence of falsified surveys, forged documents, and now testimony proving your primary witness against McCallum was describing a natural death, not murder." He fixed Kettering with a stern gaze. "I suggest you consider your next words very carefully, sir. They may well be heard again in a federal investigation." Kettering's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he gathered his papers with trembling hands and sat down hard in his chair. Hattie Mae's heart soared. She reached for Silas's hand, squeezing it tight as hope blazed bright in her chest. Bear stood straight and tall now, his chains seeming more like badges of honor than marks of shame. Judge Hawthorne cleared his throat. "In light of these revelations, this court finds the following. First, that the charges against Bear McCallum are hereby dismissed. The evidence clearly shows no crime was committed." The chains were removed from Bear's wrists with a loud clank. "Second," the judge continued, "all railroad claims to the Carter homestead and surrounding properties are suspended pending federal review. The original treaties and surveys presented by Reverend Blackfox will be entered into evidence." He turned to where Kettering sat seething. "Agent Kettering, you will remain in this jurisdiction pending investigation into these matters. Bailiff, please ensure the railroad's representatives understand they are not to leave town." The gavel cracked like thunder. "This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in movement and sound. Hattie Mae sat stunned, tears flowing freely as Bear walked toward her, finally free. Reverend Elijah smiled gently, gathering his precious documents with careful hands. "Thank you," Hattie Mae whispered as Bear reached her. "Thank you all for speaking truth." Bear's voice was gruff with emotion. "You showed the way, girl. Standing up when it mattered most." Ezra Tate hobbled over, his cane tapping on the wooden floor. "Least I could do after what you did for me and Jake." He extended a gnarled hand to Bear. "Been carrying that truth too long." As they made their way out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Hattie Mae felt lighter than she had in weeks. The truth had finally come to light, proving what she had known in her heart since that day at the auction block, that sometimes mercy could reveal the true worth of a person's soul. Reverend Elijah fell into step beside them, his satchel of documents clutched protectively. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said softly. "Sometimes it takes a child's faith to show us the path to justice." Hattie Mae wiped her eyes with her handkerchief, overwhelmed by the day's events. Around them, townspeople gathered in small groups, discussing the shocking revelations about the railroad's schemes. The tide of opinion had turned, and, with it, the future of their community hung in the balance. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Railroad men poured from the saloons, their hired guns glinting in the afternoon sun. Kettering's voice rang out, sharp with fury. "Get them!" A stone whistled through the air toward Hattie Mae. Bear, still wearing his chains, lunged to shield her with his broad frame. The rock struck his shoulder with a dull thud. "Stop this!" Sheriff Dunn's voice cracked like a whip. He stood in the street, hand hovering near his gun, face twisted with uncertainty. Years of railroad bribes warred with the truth he'd witnessed in court. "You saw the evidence, same as everyone," called out Silas, the one-armed veteran. "Time to choose right over might, Sheriff." Townsfolk began emerging from shops and offices. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, stepped forward first. "That girl spoke truth," she declared, moving to stand beside Hattie Mae. Others followed, forming a protective circle. Later that night, the boarding house hummed with whispered conversations. "Did you see those forged papers? Never thought I'd side with Bear McCallum." In her small room, Hattie Mae knelt beside her bed, hands clasped tight. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. As dawn broke the next morning, the courthouse bell began to toll, calling everyone to hear the final verdict. Judge Harrison's weathered hands smoothed the papers before him. The packed courtroom held its breath as he cleared his throat. In light of the evidence presented, this court finds Bear McCallum innocent of all charges. His gavel cracked against wood. Furthermore, the railroad's deeds are hereby declared fraudulent and void. The Carter homestead and all contested lands shall remain with their rightful owners. The courthouse erupted in cheers. Hattie Mae pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Railroad Agent Kettering's face twisted with rage as Sheriff Dunn firmly escorted him and his men toward the door. Bear, now unchained, crossed the wooden floor to where Hattie Mae stood trembling, his massive frame lowered to one knee before her, not as a prisoner this time, but as a free man making a choice. "Miss Hattie Mae," his deep voice carried clearly through the commotion, "you bought me with a silver dollar and mercy when I deserved neither. I pledge myself as your brother and protector, free and willing for all my days." Reverend Elijah stepped forward, wrapping an arm around Hattie Mae's shoulders. Doña Rosa embraced her from the other side as sobs of joy shook her frame. The girl who'd once been mocked by all now stood surrounded by family, chosen by love and forged in trial. Autumn painted the Colorado hills in gold and crimson as neighbors gathered at the Carter homestead. The afternoon air carried wood smoke and the rich aroma of Doña Rosa's stew bubbling in iron pots. Her new cabin, built by willing hands through late summer, stood proudly beside the original house. Reverend Elijah's deep voice led the Thanksgiving prayer, his words carrying across the yard where tables groaned with harvest bounty. Silas, perched on a hay bale, drew his bow across fiddle strings, filling the air with joyful tunes that made children dance. Hattie Mae moved among her guests, ladling hot stew into outstretched bowls. Her face glowed with quiet pride as folks thanked her warmly, calling her Miss Hattie with genuine respect. No mockery touched this gathering, only gratitude and fellowship. Near the barn, Bear sat surrounded by children, his huge hands surprisingly gentle as he helped them carve grinning faces into pumpkins. His deep laugh rolled out whenever they showed him their work. As lantern light began to glow in the deepening dusk, Hattie Mae paused to take in the scene. Her single silver dollar had purchased far more than Bear's freedom that day at auction. It had bought her own liberation from shame, showing her true worth in the eyes of God and community. Evening settled over the homestead like a soft blanket, bringing with it the peaceful quiet that comes after a day of celebration. Inside the kitchen, the warm glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on weathered walls. The last dishes had been cleared, but no one seemed eager to leave the comfort of gathered fellowship. Bear's broad frame filled his chair beside Hattie Mae at the head of the table. His eyes, once hard with mistrust, now held a gentle warmth as he bowed his head. Around the table sat their chosen family, Doña Rosa, her shawl wrapped tight against the autumn chill, Reverend Elijah, his kind face serene, and Silas, his fiddle resting silent in his lap. Hattie Mae's clear voice lifted in prayer, steady and sure where once it might have trembled. "Lord, we thank you for mercy that changes hearts, for strength in darkness, and for family found in times of trial." Outside, crickets wove their evening song through the rustling leaves, while autumn wind whispered against window panes. Hattie Mae felt peace settle deep in her bones. Gone was the shame that had haunted her steps, replaced by the quiet dignity of a woman who had stood firm for justice. As lamplight caught her smile, she whispered words meant only for her own heart. $1 bought everything. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.